Acompaña la Universidad de California en nuestra Universidad de Guadalajara. El panel tiene como título Abrazos o disparos. ¿Cuál es la estrategia adecuada para abordar el problema de la delincuencia? En este panel vamos a hablar de un análisis comparativo entre algunas de las políticas contra el crimen y estrategias que abordan las causas estructurales de violencia. Nos acompañan en el presidio, como moderadora, la maestra Sara Carolina González Medina, profesora de la Universidad de Guadalajara. El doctor Rogelio Barba Álvarez, jefe de Departamento de Estudios Interdisciplinares en Ciencias Penales. La doctora Nancy Rodríguez, de la Universidad de California. El doctor David Brotherton. Y el doctor Robert Wade. A continuación, cederé el uso de la voz a la moderadora, la maestra Sara Carolina.
Muchas gracias. Vamos a dar entonces continuidad a esta jornada, como lo escucharon con el panel ahora denominado Abrazos o Disparos, sobre cuál es la estrategia adecuada para abordar el problema de la delincuencia. Aquí escucharemos algún análisis comparativo entre estas políticas de mano dura contra el crimen y las estrategias que se proponen. En primer lugar, escucharemos, sin mayor preámbulo, al doctor David Brotherton. Adelante, doctor.
Muy bien, muchas gracias por la invitación, por presentar los conocimientos y memorias y reflexiones de mi carrera de los últimos 20 años. Y voy a hablar en inglés porque la producción es simultánea. Y para empezar sobre mi trabajo en el área de diputaciones. In 2001, I went to Santo Domingo to present on my work on the Latin kings and queens in New York City. And they wanted me to talk about Dominican subcultures in New York. At the end of my talk in Spanish, a long audience about maybe twice the size of here, opened up the questions. And the only questions they had was, why are you sending them all back here? Los delincuentes, los pandilleros. Why are you sending them all back here? I didn't know what they were talking about. And I turned to my compañero, Professor Abrazos. I said, what are they talking about with this? He says, true. Hundreds of people are going missing in our barrio, in Washington Heights. Many of them from my congregation, because he was also a priest, a Episcopalian priest, as well as a professor of Latin American studies. So I said, well, I'm an ethnographer, a social scientist, a critical social scientist, and I respond to the community vis-a-vis their concerns and questions. So I'll find out. I went back to New York, and I had one of my undergraduate students, a Dominicana. I said, go and find out what the issues about this deportation is going on in Washington Heights. And she came back 3 months later, and she said, Dave, nobody wants to talk about it. Talking about people who are missing from our community and being deported after the 1996 draconian laws in the United States is a taboo. It's a taboo because they say, us, Dominicanos, Dominican Americans, we're already stigmatized, as if we're all part of the drug trade. And for us to start talking about the people who are being kicked out for life, it brings more negative attention to our community. 1 year later, 2002, I moved to Santo Domingo with my wife and 2 little kids. And I spent a year there researching the issue of Dominicans deported primarily from New York, and wrote the first book in criminology and sociology on deportations in 2011, and founded the area of both post-deportation studies, which is one of the reasons you're here today. In 2003, myself and some faculty from the UAS, Universidad Autónoma de Santo Domingo, the first university in the Americas, organized the first conference on deportation in the Caribbean in 2003, 22 years ago. And then I realized it was also the first conference on deportation in Latin America. 1 year later, over 1,000 people came to that conference over 2 days and blew the taboo sky high. Because it wasn't only a taboo in the US, it was a taboo in the Dominican Republic. Because the only thing you knew about deportees were when they were splashed across the front page of Listing Diario, or one of the Universal, or something like that, one of the other papers, and it was all about 50 deportees landed in Santo Domingo Airport. Among them are killers, drug dealers, couples, and that was the deportee as a photo. In 2004, I organised the first deportation conference in the United States in October 2004. And again, over 1,500 people came to the conference. And that conference was my compañero Alex Sanchez from Estados Unidos, who was the first gang member ever to be returned to his country where he was raised. So this conference, I want to get this out of the way, is basically historically a continuation of these early conferences. So you stand in a line, right, from work has been done previously in this kind of fairly orthodox thing called social science. Because social science doesn't have to be boring and orthodox. It can be critical, empowering, and exposing the root causes of crime and deviance in our society. And that's what we're here to do. On the actual subject about which we're supposed to be talking, Abrazos O Balazos, I'll talk a little bit about my work in Ecuador. After I came back from Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, and wrote a book and all this, I get a call in 2007 from people in Ecuador. And at that point in time, you probably remember that a guy called Rafael Correa became the president under a leftist nationalist program called the Citizens' Revolution. And Correa faced several major issues for his program of mass education, mass public health, and mass empowerment, because it was all, his program was based on everyone is a citizen. We don't have second-class citizens in this country. But as a citizen, you've also got responsibilities. You've got responsibilities to you, your family, and your community. But he faced this problem. One country, look at Colombia, close to, next to Ecuador, one of the largest drug trafficking countries in the world. The other side is Peru, one of the largest drug producing countries in the world. So he did not want, in his new revolution, to have the cartels there. And at that time, you remember, Colombia was, the homicide rate was about 55 per 100,000. Incredible levels of violence. The problem he had these very large street gangs. Which street gangs? The kings and queens from Chicago and New York were now down in Ecuador. They had about 8 to 10,000 members. The nietas that grew up in the prison confines of Puerto Rico were down there. They had about 7,000 to 8,000 members. Another group called Masters of the Street, who were along the Pacific coast, they had about 8,000 members. So what are we going to do and have a revolution when we've got these large street gangs, and at the moment our policy is basically mano dura, zero tolerance, whose birth was in actually New York City. I'd written this book with Barrios in 2004 about Latin kings and developed this idea of street organisations instead of calling them gangs. And said that street organisations can change. They don't have to be anti-social. Don't have to be the early foot soldiers of the cartels. They don't have to be this folk devil that you made them out to be, especially under policies of money. He liked the idea. In Spain, Barcelona had taken over this idea that they could change and said that the gangs in Spain, in Barcelona, also Latin kings and queens, should be known as groups of immigrant youth. And they could have access to any council property for their meetings. In Genoa, in Italy, they did the same thing. And the results of both of these policies of social inclusion was a sharp drop of recidivism, a sharp drop of conflict between these groups, a sharp drop in homicide. Correa says that's the answer. And for the first time in the history of the world, he legalized the street gangs of Ecuador. He gave these large groups the opportunity to become a form of non-profit and to get grants from the government to develop all kinds of social activities and economic activities for their community, which was always the most marginalized communities in Ecuador. 2007. 10 years later. 2017. I'm sitting in the Ministry of Justice with the Minister of Justice. And he says to me, look Dave, look at the new homicide rates. And he has a big board in front of his desk. And the graph is going down. From 2007 to 2017. It goes down from 17 per 100,000 to 6. And I said, this is amazing. Who else knows this outside of the Ministry of Justice? He said, well, we'll put it on the website. I said, but look what you're looking at. This is amazing. And what happened in 2007? He said, well, you know, we reformed the police. I said, yes, you reformed the police, but you also legalised the bloody gangs. You did what nobody else has done. And look at, that's not necessarily causal, but it has to have a relationship. Because the gangs weren't at war with each other, or between each other. That policy then started to have more of a dissemination around the world. And the Igarapi Institute in Rio de Janeiro is the largest homicide institute in the world, called Ecuador the most sustainable drop in homicide on the globe in 2017. Fast forward, 2022, 2023. The largest massacres in prison history in Latin America. Where? Ecuador. 450 inmates slaughtered. 450 inmates slaughtered. Half of them with their heads cut off. And 3 massacres. Late 2023, Ecuador has the highest rate of homicide in the world at 47 per 100,000. And in Esmeraldas, it reaches 76, higher than at any time in Colombia. What's happened? What's happened? This is absolutely key to understanding criminology and the relationship between politics and what goes on in the street. And I'll finish here. 2017, Lenin Moreno takes over. He's the successor to Correa. He says he's going to continue the counter-revolution. Within 2 months, he steps to the complete other side of the political line and introduces extreme neoliberal policies, very similar to what's going on in the United States. To hollow the state, to cut the federal workforce, to close down all social programs, to reduce money to public health, and to reduce money going to the correctional service. Moreno does a deal with the cartels take over the prison population, the prison population explodes to about 42,000, and we have this extraordinary catastrophe which is going on to this day. These are the lessons we need to learn both in sociology and criminology. The politics makes all the difference in the world, and a progressive, humanistic, radical politics work. They're not simply ideas in their head, fictions. They work in practice. The only problem is they work in Latin America and no one gives a shit about Latin America. Quite frankly, from El Norte, these are the lessons. Thank you very much.
Agradecemos al doctor David Roper por esta primera participación y a continuación escucharemos al doctor Rogelio Barba Álvarez.
¿Qué tal? Muy buenas tardes. Toda esta ponencia fue estructurada por mis becarios que se encuentran en mi oficina y que obviamente quiero agradecer a Cintia Caterín, a Nancy Gisela y a Stephanie Martínez. Bueno, pues en cada sexenio siempre se ha querido combatir el tema de la criminalidad convencional o no convencional, ¿sí? No convencional relacionada a la criminalidad organizada. Y la estrategia de cada gobierno pues es endurecer el sistema penal. Endurecer el sistema penal, crear nuevos delitos y aumentar penas. Desde el 2011 hay una sensación de inseguridad registrada en las encuestas nacionales de victimización y percepción del delito, el INVIPE, en el cual la primera preocupación del ciudadano y de los jóvenes de 18 a 25 años es la inseguridad y después el trabajo. Y en esa encuesta pues arrojan muchísimos datos que el gobierno no atiende o no ataca o no pone atención, toda vez que se podría hacer alguna política pública alejada a estos discursos populistas como la guerra contra el narcotráfico de Calderón o esta idea, que no fue una política, sino fue una idea de abrazos no balazos, porque no hay nada registrado en relación a este dicho por el presidente desde que fue candidato o que era representante del gobierno en el Distrito Federal. Él más bien lo que quería era darles más oportunidades a los jóvenes, oportunidades en la escuela, oportunidades en el deporte, pero lo que se hizo por parte del gobierno federal anterior pues es darles dinero a los jóvenes y obviamente pues generar personas que ni trabajan ni estudian. Y eso obviamente no disminuyó esa brecha criminal, sino aumentó de manera desmesurada. En este sexenio pasado, porque primero voy a hablar sobre la criminalidad, cómo aumentó cualitativa y cuantitativamente, para después dar alguna propuesta de la que se puede adoptar, como dice el doctor, algunas políticas públicas de Centroamérica. No hablo de Salvador. Por ejemplo, tenemos que desde el gobierno de Miguel de la Madrid, en los años 80, teníamos 87, tuvo en el sexenio fueron 87,000 homicidios en ese sexenio. Si nosotros intentamos compararlos con otros países, por ejemplo Brasil, en Brasil hay actualmente se cometen 50,000 homicidios por cada año, 50,000 homicidios. En el anterior sexenio de Peña Nieto no llegamos ni a 15,000 homicidios al año. Hoy estamos llegando a 30,000 homicidios al año. Con Carlos Salinas de Gortari bajó la tasa de homicidios a 82,450, es decir, una tasa de 17 personas por cada 100,000 habitantes. Con Vicente Fox llegamos a 10, que la ONU es la que más o menos permite o establece que son 10 por cada 100,000 habitantes. Recuerden que para medir la violencia, pues se registran el número de homicidios por cada 100,000 habitantes, y obviamente en México pues ha rebasado esa tasa, tal y como dijo el doctor. Con Peña Nieto fueron 22 por cada 100,000 habitantes, y con AMLO sube a 25 por cada 100,000 habitantes. En total de estos últimos sexenios, desde el 83 al 2024, pues casi llegamos a la cifra escalofriante de 1,000,000 de personas muertas de manera dolosa, es decir, los homicidios dolosos. Siempre se trató de hablar por parte del gobierno federal anterior sobre sus dichos, que no los puso en práctica, la verdad, de no mentir, no robar, no traicionar. Toda vez que México es uno de los países más corruptos del mundo, y se trató de contener la criminalidad, no endureciendo el Código Penal, pero sí militarizando lo que no habían hecho los otros gobiernos. Los hizo Andrés Manuel López Obrador, modificando la Constitución. ¿Y cómo fue que lo hizo? Pues muy fácil. Sí, se crea la Guardia Nacional, se modifica el artículo 21 constitucional, que delega, ¿sí?, a la Federación, a los estados y a los municipios la seguridad, y lo que hace pues es fortalecer una fuerza especial, enmascarada, ¿sí?, y que atrás está la Secretaría de la Sedena. De esta manera tenemos que algunas actividades que realizaban, por ejemplo, la prevención del delito, ¿sí?, se enfoca obviamente, o sea, en los 3 niveles de gobierno, pero sobre todo la Policía Federal y las policías locales. Pero con esta reforma que hizo Calderón hacia muchísimos artículos de la Constitución, pues este trabajo se lo delega a la Guardia Nacional en varios artículos. Igual la salvaguardia y la integridad de las personas y de su patrimonio, que le corresponde a la Policía Federal; realizar investigaciones que le corresponde a la Policía Federal mediante la celebración de convenios; llevar a cabo operaciones encubiertas; se reforma la Ley Federal contra la Delincuencia Organizada en el artículo 11, para reconocer al agente encubierto y aquellas medidas de investigación de la delincuencia organizada. Y así como funciones de vigilancia, verificación e inspección en colaboración con otras autoridades, todo está delegado a la Guardia Nacional. Y bueno, los resultados pues no se vieron reflejados con esta delegación que le hace a la Guardia Nacional, toda vez que aumentó cuantitativamente el número de homicidios y el número de desapariciones. Se quiere tratar de endurecer la legislación a través del Código Penal. Por ejemplo, se reformó el Código Penal de Jalisco en el 2014 para aumentar la pena del delito de feminicidio, pero también aumentaron los feminicidios. Es decir, la mano dura que se representa por parte de los gobiernos de poder controlar, de poder cohesionar a la sociedad por medio de endurecimiento de penas o de creación de normas, lo que provoca es obviamente es un desbordamiento que hay de la delincuencia convencional y no convencional. La muestra clara y la que nosotros hemos analizado y cuestionado fue el tema reciente de Caro Quintero. Caro Quintero pasó 30 años en prisión, no fue sentenciado, al final lo sentencian y sale de prisión, lo reaprenden, pero todos los delitos que cometió ya habían prescrito. Aún así, se entrega a esta figura pública que bueno, no alcanzó el perdón del artículo 18 constitucional, que al final de cuentas nuestra Constitución establece que el fin de la pena es la reinserción a través del trabajo, de la educación. Sin embargo, pasaron más de 30 años y no se alcanzó a reinsertar. Es decir, yo creo que se tiene que modificar la Constitución para dar un parámetro mucho más elevado, ¿sí? De esta manera tenemos un caos legislativo que creo que se debe analizar desde el punto de vista transversal, es decir, desde el gobierno federal y estatal, para contener un solo manual de delitos que pueden permitir aplicar la pena, individualizarla y no exagerar ni potencializar y radicalizar la sociedad por medio de la ejemplarizante pena. Por ejemplo, en Chihuahua tenemos la pena indeterminada, el feminicidio que llega a 70 años de prisión, una persona de 40 años que comete un delito de feminicidio, obviamente que va a terminar en la cárcel. Entonces, esa reflexión que se tiene por parte del gobierno, esa preocupación que se tiene por controlar la criminalidad, pues no da resultados ni con el endurecimiento, ni con la creación de normas, sino que se tiene que establecer a partir de políticas públicas que verdaderamente den resultado. En Honduras, hace 2 o 3 sexenios, tenían la cifra más alta de América Latina sobre homicidios. Llegaban las cifras de 70 homicidios por cada 100.000 habitantes y en 4 años bajaron el 40% de los homicidios en Honduras. ¿Cómo lo hicieron? Fue que ellos renovaron la estructura policial, formaron a los policías, le dotaron de instrumentos y sobre todo de un aumento de salario y le dieron certeza económica y un futuro a las familias que se enfrentaban cada día en las calles. Por lo tanto, se puede reducir la criminalidad de manera inteligente, se puede reducir la criminalidad obviamente trabajando de manera transversal y por supuesto no endureciendo o creando tipos penales que ni se van a aplicar o que son muy benevolentes para los criminales. Porque la política que tiene El Salvador es decir, elimino los derechos humanos de las personas, que son pandillas, que es muy distinta la criminalidad no convencional. Aquí son organizaciones no tan secretas, pero que tienen operaciones que se pueden filtrar por el gobierno, proponer, por ejemplo, candidatos a los gobiernos municipales a través federal. Hemos conocido, por ejemplo, la diputada, tenemos ahí algunos presidentes municipales que han sido promovidos por algunas organizaciones criminales y tenido el poder para representar, ¿sí?, esa parte oscura de la sociedad que representa la criminalidad. Se tiene que reformar el artículo, por ejemplo, el artículo 2 de la ley de contra la delincuencia organizada para poder establecer que las organizaciones criminales no solamente cometen el catálogo de delitos que establece el artículo 2 con el estilo de delincuencia organizada, sino también homicidios, extorsión, robo.
I asked Ricardo and Ryan what I should address and what would they like for me to address. We had many discussions about whether I should present work on my own research or more broadly present some of my contributions to a pretty significant National Academies report. So we decided that it would be best to frame my remarks, and I promise they are quick and to the point, around this particular report produced by the National Academies on reducing inequality in crime and the justice system, that was produced a year and a half ago. I was one of 15 committee members, a multidisciplinary national committee comprised of historians, legal scholars, psychologists, sociologists, political scientists, economists, who were given the task of combing through the science that tells us why people who engage in the justice system are harmed and how the system produces inequality. So I spent 3.5 years working with this committee to produce this report. It is nearly 400 pages. I encourage you to read it when you have time, but you need not worry. I'm going to present to you the key findings from that work that I think completely align with what Dr. Brotherton and what Dr. Badra have just said about our policies geared at reducing crime and reducing the number of people who are negatively impacted by the justice system. So I'll begin with our 3 primary findings out of this 400-page document. Our findings that, again, we gathered from reviewing the evidence, and something that I should note about the National Academies is that the reports that are produced by the National Academies are considered among the most privileged scientific documents produced in the U.S. because they represent consensus reports. That means that we as a committee had to agree on how to review and adjudicate the evidence on this topic. That's why it took us nearly 4 years to all agree on what the evidence is telling us and what it is not. Is no easy task, especially when you bring people with very different disciplinary expertise. So with that, our first finding that we came to realization that we felt was important to note is that any policy aimed at reducing crime and reducing inequality produced by the justice system had to happen at every stage of the system. That means focusing on policing, the courts, and the correctional system. Any intervention or any policy geared at one of those stages was not going to reduce crime. It was not going to reduce the harm produced by the system. I obviously have particular examples of those specific changes in policy within the systems that I can talk to, but let me go to the second finding for the sake of time. We, as a committee, concluded that policies by the justice system, carried out by the justice system alone, were not going to reduce crime. Structural reforms to improve our public communities, our public spaces, reduce poverty, improve our capacity for lawful employment, had to come along and complement any effort at modifying the justice system. So if our focus is strictly on improving police practices or improving the efficiency of how we respond to people who are engaged in crime, that is not going to be enough. Our third key finding is that investing in communities is vital. Communities that are often disenfranchised and marginalized had to be at the forefront of our policy interventions. For us, That was key. So much so that members of the committee felt that the lived experience of people most impacted by crime and the justice system were evidence, and that we needed to hear from them in our deliberations and take that as part of the cumulative body of information that we were consuming. I want to now turn to the 4 guiding principles that we as a National Academies felt were central for any policymaker at the local, state, or federal level in order to improve the treatment of people impacted by the justice system. And the first one, and this has guided all of our work, and we felt that, again, it should be what guides people looking for policy changes, is that we have to understand the harms of the system. And that those harms, we may not understand as academics and as researchers. That's why it is so important to hear directly from people impacted by crime and the justice system. Our second guiding principle centered on accountability and transparency. And that for us meant ensuring that the people that we claim to be most interested in helping and assisting with our policy changes and programs, that they are fully aware of what we are doing to improve their conditions and being transparent in all of those efforts. Third, and related, that we must partner with community organizations that are vested in those communities. That means that the justice system alone should not be the only entity geared at improving those communities. And finally, it is vital for us to not only include communities, but recognize how different communities are. And that one program or one policy that might improve the well-being of community members in one jurisdiction may not necessarily work in another. That is why it is so important to have community members voice and convey how they see safety and how best to improve safety. Those are the points I wanted to share with you. Again, I think they align with what we've heard thus far. I encourage you to look at the report. I'm happy to answer any questions about it. Thank you so much for having me.
Muchas gracias, doctora. Ahora escucharemos al doctor Robert White.
Thank you for having me here again. I recognize many of you students came a month ago and gave a talk for the criminology program, and I think you liked what I had to say, so I'm going to add a few words about some recent events that have occurred since then. But first I want to thank Dr. Barba for his welcoming us all here, and for Dr. Rodriguez for doing something I can never do, which is get the support of her university. And also I want to thank, of course, Ricardo and Flaco for doing the legwork of putting this all together, and all of the other students who've helped out. I'm very impressed with all of you. And of course, my thanks to, always an honor to be with my mentor here. David Brotherton was my PhD advisor for my doctorate. So you know where I get my ideas from. If I say anything that's maybe a little bit too far, you can blame him. And I do intend to push the conversation a bit to the left. First off, I consider myself a man of integrity, and I always admit when I'm wrong about something. And the last time I was here, we talked about the kidnapping of El Mayo. Right? And I suggested that, well, this is maybe a good sign for the Madera government that, the U.S. this time, whereas Calderon would collaborate with the U.S. policy, this time the U.S. had to come and kidnap El Mayo without the Mexican government knowing what happened. And, you know, at least that's a sign that maybe the government is not cooperating with the U.S. policy, right? But maybe I was a little naive. I think, what was it, a week or two after I came, what happened, the president capitulated to Trump and flushed the sovereignty of the Mexican nation down the toilet. Gave over 29 individuals. Rafael Caro Quintero is the most well-known, but supposedly there were 28 other jefes. I'm not an expert enough on the trade to know what their actual involvement was, or what the extent of their criminality, or whatever reasons they chose these people out of who knows how many they could have. But clearly this is an act of capitulation and collaboration with the U.S. government. Now, Ricardo suggested, well, you know, people in Mexico think that maybe this was a good thing. Why should we save these 29 assholes just to, and then they're going to put these tariffs on us? We give over these 29 people, and then they're not going to do the tariffs to us, right? And I said, are you kidding me? Do you really think that anything you can do in this country is going to affect what the hell Trump does? Like, I don't think Trump even knows what he's going to do tomorrow, right? It's, you know, there's absolutely nothing that anyone in this or any other country can do that will avoid or prevent anything that Trump is going to do. And I think we all know that the whole business about deportation and about gang members and cartels and all that, you know, Mexicans are criminals and rapists and all this nonsense. This is just a racist dog whistle that Republicans, that right-wing, well, both of the parties in America are right-wing, that politicians in America use to get votes, right? Because Americans are racists and they hate Mexican people. So all you have to do is, you know, throw Mexican people under the bus and Americans will vote for you. And this is about as simple as Trump's, you know, election strategy is, right? So the idea that you can do something here in this country to prevent him from using the strategy that's gotten him elected twice, right? It's ludicrous, right? It's a figment of your imagination. Now, it's ironic that these, you know, one thing that would seem ironic to me as I drive around Guadalajara is everywhere I go, I see these posters that bring a tear to my eyes of all of the people who disappeared, right? And there's so many people have disappeared in this country, there's probably not too many families that don't know someone who has disappeared. And it seems an awful irony that now the government has disappeared these 29 people. Will any of us ever see these men again? Right? Are these people not also disappeared? To be killed in a concrete tube in the mountains of Colorado in Florence ADX, right? Just as they've done to El Chapo and where El Mayo is going to go for sure, right? It's really, you know, very similar if you think about the behavior between the government and the cartels. What is this policy that the U.S. government has been pursuing in this country, and in its own country, and in every country for decades and decades, is what we call the kingpin strategy, right? And the logic is, you know, so simple it's stupid that if you can cut the head off of a snake, you'll kill the snake, right? But, of course, that's never what happens, right? And there's actually a really impressive literature, as I mentioned in my previous talk, about the narco trade that establishes very clearly that when, you know, the jefes are killed or imprisoned, the result of that is always more violence, right? And my own research on gangs and prisons in the U.S. has established that criminalized communities, so-called organized crime organizations, right, actually in aggregate have a mitigating effect on violence. My research focuses on so-called prison gangs in the U.S., particularly the Mexican mafia, and I've established that, you know, over the period of time that the Mexican mafia has established hegemony in California prisons, the weapon violence, the violence involving, you know, attempts to kill people has absolutely collapsed to about 25% of its peak. And my book that was published the same year in 2022 talks about not just the hunger strike that ended the extended solitary confinement, but also the agreement to end hostilities that was initiated by the leaders of the so-called prison gangs, the inmate organizations. And what has been the result of this agreement to end hostilities is a collapse in violence on general population yards in California prisons. And this example that they've set has also filtered onto the street. I give a single case study in my book about the peace treaty between East Coast Crips and Florencia Blese, which was made possible by the prior agreement to end hostilities. And for those of you who know me, I've done a lot of work, and Flacco's been right there with me, bringing gang members together and ending the violence between them, right? What's law enforcement's response been to this? Right? The Rico police came to my door at 8 o'clock in the morning, right? Asking what my relationship is to the Mexican mafia, right? Because the last thing they want is for there to be any structure that can exist that can intervene to mitigate violence among criminalized communities. And this policy that's pursued against so-called gangs in the US, that actually has the effect of exacerbating violence rather than reducing it, is the same policy the US has for the narco trade here in Mexico and throughout Latin America, right? It's something that I explained theoretically with the title Structural Disorganization. That when there is a lack of structure in criminalized communities, the result is an increase in violence. And so criminalized communities being structured and organized, right, independent of the state, right? I'm not talking about like what David was talking about, where the state actually helped criminalized communities to structure themselves, right? Or what Dr. Barba talked about, the differences in policies in Mexican government, independent of what the government does, right? Structure within a criminalized community will mitigate violence. And we know this. It's been statistically proven, you know, both in the narco trade and my own research in the US. And so we have to think for a second, right? This policy of mano dura, right? What is the purpose of this policy, right? What is the U.S. government trying to achieve? They can't possibly claim that they don't know it's going to result in more violence, right? Because if we know it, certainly they know it, right? And so every time they come into Mexico and in the old days, Calderon's government would do their dirty work for them. Right, cut the head off the snake for the U.S. government. And El Mayo, they came and kidnapped El Mayo themselves. It has the same effect. What happened after El Mayo got kidnapped? There's a huge war in Sinaloa right now. Thousands of people have been killed as a result. Right? Did the U.S. government not know that that would be the result of what their actions were? And now the Mexican government has signaled that it's going to cooperate with this policy, right, by turning over these 29 men. What's the next step for the Mexican government? What's going to happen if first of all, I was naive to think that maybe the Mexican government didn't know that El Mayo was going to be kidnapped. Certainly this collaboration suggests that I was wrong about that, right? So what's next? Are U.S. Special Forces going to come here and assassinate the leaders of Cartel New Generacion? What's going to be the result of that? Think about where this collaboration is going to lead to, right? If the Mexican government allows the U.S. to continue this policy of kingpin strategy, we have 20 years of history to know what the result of that is going to be. Is more people are going to be murdered, more people are going to be disappeared. So we have to think about, what is corruption? A simpleton's idea of corruption is that, the police and, many of the institutions in this country are corrupt. The police this is a true story, caught my friend painting graffiti and took him to the ATM and made him empty out his bank account. Is that corrupt? Of course it's corrupt, right? Is it scary? Of course it's scary, right? But is the result, compare the result of that type of corruption to the type of corruption of the state collaborating with foreign policy of another country it has the effect of killing hundreds of thousands of people here in Mexico, right? That is corruption, right? And so this government, you know, and the people of Mexico need to ask themselves, we've seen what's happened as a result of this collaboration over the last 2 decades, right? What will the future hold? And, you know, maybe in closing, it seems inconceivable that, you know, how could the government resist the United States? The United States is the most powerful country in the world. Shouldn't the Mexican government roll over and do whatever America wants it to? Compare Mexico's response to these threats from the Trump administration to the response of Canada. What's Canada's response been to Trump's threats of tariffs? Oh, you're going to tariff us? Okay, we'll shut off your electricity. We'll shut off your gas. They even took the whiskey off the shelves in the supermarkets. No American products are being sold in Canada right now either. Right? There was no attempt to have a phone call with Donald Trump to flatter him and to somehow, you know, charm him into avoiding the tariffs that he's going to do, or maybe he's not going to do, or maybe he'll back them up, or maybe he'll start them again. Right? There's absolutely nothing that can be done to deal with Trump except to oppose him. And it seems like, you know, much of the rest of the world, Canada and Europe, realize this, and for some reason the Mexican government seems to still be thinking that there's some way to negotiate with this type of policy. Thank you.
Agradecemos también la participación del doctor y en obviedad del tiempo daremos paso a un par de preguntas si en la audiencia quisieran hacer alguno de los cuestionamientos para nuestros panelistas. Parece que ha quedado todo muy claro. Agradecemos a los panelistas y entonces pasaría con ellos para darles un par de minutos si quieren hacer alguna conclusión. Inicio en el mismo orden que fueron sus presentaciones. Doctor David.
I mean, so what we have here, right, is very diverse ways of doing criminology. Right? I mean, this is what you're here for, to understand what the relationship is interdisciplinary, in an interdisciplinary way to migration. Right? And what you'll hear is very fundamental truth, if we can still talk about truth in this world. And something which Durkheim, famous, one of the pioneers of sociology, and that is that the social is complex. Okay, the sociality is complex. And what that means is that you know, what you've got with mano dura, and you've got with these kinds of policies, you know, you've got this thing about if all you have is a hammer, then everything is a nail. Right? And all about the issues we're talking about is organised crime, or it's delinquency, or it's you know, state corruption, and so on and so forth. You've always got to go to the roots of crime if you want to address the issues in any kind of meaningful policy. It's no good just talking about you know, the superficial, how the crime appears, how crime, you know, is this or that, and you put it in a category and all the rest of it, and that's how we develop a policy of social control. Right? What you have to understand is that criminology, you know, criminology here is mainly under, a lot of Latin America is within law schools, but for us it's comes out of sociology. Right? Both here and also in my country, in Nigeria. And so, you know, our approach is different in terms of, you know, we're always looking at sort of social causation, but also, you know, how we come together in solidarity, which is part of what this is, to overcome the social problems that we're facing, the challenges, right? And this means that, you know, knowledge has to be developed, not simply for the institutions and by the institutions, but that knowledge has to go back to the people who are facing most of these problems. Knowledge in the sense of knowing more about our community than we can just get from experience. Right? Because if a lot of our people in our different marginalised communities, we don't really know about the histories of our communities. Because the way we're raised within our educational systems, most of the time our history is denied us. And that goes for this country too, not just the United States. So we come at this from the perspective of social science to break down these boundaries, to radicalise the production and the dissemination of knowledge, and turn knowledge into a form of praxis so that it influences social action. Okay? So it's not, so we get away from simply about knowledge in the abstract, which is a lot of what we're here now, but knowledge for us in order to engage in social action, to engage in new forms of agency, to transform this highly unequal society that's leaving us exasperated, confused, and certainly in the Trumpian period, almost fatalistic. And that's what we've got to resist. And I think that's what Robert is talking about in terms of how you fight autocracy, how you fight authoritarianism, how you oppose neo-fascism, is you fight. You fight. And you fight for the long term, not for these episodes. But that requires also a much more thorough going analysis of the society, because you have to build a new society. It's not enough simply to reform the one we have. And the other point I want to make here, without being too dramatic, but I'm afraid I have to be, is that we don't have a lot of time. We don't have a lot of time. Because we're in a period of climate extinction. You have to be a total ostrich in order to ignore that. But not only that, if you look at the events which are taking place, they are taking place at ever-quickening speed. If, as Nancy Fraser said, the invasion of Iraq was like Vietnam on crack, then this period of Trumpism is like Trump 1.0 on meth.
Bueno, yo solamente voy a decir algo. Lo que tú... Bueno, Raúl Salinas de Gortari, hermano de Carlos Salinas de Gortari, se le regresó, después de 10 años de prisión se le liberó. Él sacó más de 3.000 millones de pesos al extranjero. Se los tuvieron que regresar. El presidente Andrés Manuel López Obrador dejó libre a un pariente del Chapo, al ratón, evidenciando pues el vínculo que hay, saludando a la mamá del Chapo. Pero bueno, pues eso habla de la corrupción que impera en nuestro país por parte del gobierno. Pero curiosamente, quiero decirles que curiosamente, y me siento muy orgulloso, que bueno, uno de los quesos más ricos y sabrosos del mundo, en el tercer lugar es el de Oaxaca. El año pasado, en el 2024, recibimos a 38.33 millones de turistas. Somos el primer país en Latinoamérica. Quien nos sigue hacia abajo es República Dominicana con 7.000. República Dominicana, Colombia, Argentina y Brasil ni juntos pueden llegar ni a la mitad de los turistas que vienen a México. Y además la comida mexicana cada año pues está en los primeros lugares como la más rica y la más sabrosa. Somos el país, el número 25 del mundo, de los países más felices del mundo. Curiosamente eso a mí me llama mucho la atención por los niveles de criminalidad que tenemos. Entonces si verdaderamente a la presidenta le interesara el tema de la seguridad y pusieron que vienen se duplicaría, porque tenemos un gran país. Desgraciadamente tenemos al frente dos cuestiones pues muy importantes y que nos preocupa, que es el vínculo que hay entre la delincuencia y el Estado. Muchas gracias.
Pregunto al doctor Robert si quiere hacer alguna conclusión.
La causa del crime y la primera problema social es el Estado, right? All of these problems that we have, the level of crime in a country can be directly tied to the policies of the state. People may commit crime, and the state would like us to focus on what the thoughts are of those who are engaged in violent crimes, as if they're, something to be examined in a lab. It's kind of ironic. I don't know if you've noticed what the logo is of the criminology es de UDH is a magnifying glass on the brain, as if that's where crime comes from, right? But I much prefer the other logo of criminologia, which is a guillotine. Maybe that's the solution to our problems, right? It's a bit ironic if you think about it. Is the cause of crime the minds of criminals, or is the cause of crime the oligarchs that make crime possible?
Okay.
Right? And
Two things can be true, David. And Robert,
It
right?
depends. I guess it depends on whose minds we're looking
Two
at.
things can be true,
And,
three things
and
can
the
be
solution
true.
is to separate the mind from the body of those who are responsible. It worked for the French, didn't it?
So I have a question. So, question, all of you. What would happen if crime disappeared today? Like, what would happen? Like, if crime was gone today, what would happen?
The only reason crime exists is because of the state. The only way you cannot know that is to not know the history of human beings. Human beings are Homo sapien, at least as a species, is at least 300,000 to 400,000 years old. The state is only what? 6,000 years old? 8,000 years old? Human beings lived for millennia with no state and no crime, right? And still today, even as thoroughly as this world has been conquered, there are still human beings who live in societies that are run entirely by themselves without the interference of the state. Look at these societies. Is there crime in these societies? Of course not, right? Crime is an invention of the state. It's only possible because of the state. The circumstances that cause people to engage in antisocial behavior that hurts themselves and others the root always leads back to the state, right? And what is it that exacerbates these conditions and exacerbates the harmful effects of crime? It's always the state, right?
Well, Durkheim said society, you couldn't have a society, especially, he didn't say capitalist society, just society, without crime, because you needed crime, you needed to other people in order to create, this we-ness that, he said that society seems to need to create some level of social control. Well, I think the answer is more, more kind of optimistically, is that we make certain things criminal. Poverty should be a crime. Homelessness should be a crime. Exploitation, land appropriation, rape of our natural resources. These should all be crimes. And if they were crimes, then maybe we would have the kind of values that we could all live by.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
Agradecemos a nuestros panelistas con un fuerte aplauso y damos paso a la señora.
Only said that because he wasn't in.